let me introduce our speaker today. Dr. Sally Gould-Taylor actually was willing to present and with us last month, but we had technical difficulties, so I'm very excited that she hung in there with us and is back in May to present for our Grand Rounds. She is the Director of Research and Evaluation at the Institute on Disabilities at Temple University, and within that role, she's responsible for the development, engagement, and support of research protocols, methods, and analysis throughout the Institute's various programs and initiatives. Sally's worked with both qualitative and quantitative research projects in diverse fields of human services, disability, and education. Additionally, she has taught at Temple for 9 years. She earned her PhD in urban education with a focus on anthropology of education. She's the co-principal investigator on the Transition Discoveries Project, which is a research project on successful secondary transition among youth with disabilities across Pennsylvania. And of course, that's near and dear to our heart with a focus on transition as well here at our center. Sally is currently leading 3 research and intervention projects in the field of disability, including the Comprehensive Statewide Needs Assessment for the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation in Pennsylvania, Project PLAY, that's P-L-A-A-Y, inclusive, a newly funded PA Developmental Disabilities Council grant that combines a school-based intervention with community-driven trainings aimed at addressing issues of race and disability in the school-to-prison pipeline, and a longitudinal ethnographic investigation of the closure of the Hamburg State Center. So today, she's going to present some of that work, and again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Gould-Taylor, and let's go ahead and again submit any questions you have along the way through the chat function, but we'll leave time at the end, about 10 minutes, for any questions you want to ask. With that, Dr. Gould-Taylor, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, I hope so. Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you guys and to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing here in Pennsylvania, and also a little bit about share some strategies that we use when we're thinking about maintaining a participatory kind of role in our research, whether it be kind of big picture research or small kind of qualitative stuff. So I'm going to start out a little bit. So this is a slide that just looks at our vision and mission of our institute here. But essentially the session is going to address thinking beyond the advisory board, guidelines for creating authentic, inclusive research design, protocol, data collection, and analysis, some examples of participatory action research that we've done, as well as approaches for interviewing individuals with disability for research purposes. So really we're going to look at kind of big picture research ideologies around authentic inclusion of people with disabilities in research design from beginning to end, thus kind of beyond the idea of just an advisory board as where people with disabilities can sit within a research project or program. I'm going to give you some guidelines of some practical ideas around interviewing, around the do's and don'ts. And then at the end of the session, we're going to go back and look at kind of some of these big picture guiding questions that we use and I use in my work as we develop things and move forward. And I hope this will be helpful. Okay. So as I go along and talk about examples and of ways to be inclusive in research design and carry out, I'm going to reference 3 of the projects that I work on here at the Institute on Disabilities. One is Project Play Inclusive, which PLAY stands for Preventing Long-Term Anger and Aggression in Youth. So Project Play is a psychoeducational intervention that happens in a school-based setting, and it's aimed at dismantling the power structure that happen in minute-by-minute or hour-by-hour interactions between people of color who also have disabilities and people who maintain power in those interactions that can essentially just make decisions about what will happen to them for the rest of their lives. So it's based on a intervention model that was used primarily for people of color in the Pennsylvania area, and it's been changed a little bit to be inclusive of people of color and people with disabilities. The other project that I'm going to reference is a project that we did with the National Disability Council entitled Beyond Guardianship toward Alternatives that Promote Greater Self-Determination for People with Disabilities. The publication is available in the highlighted text through the through the PowerPoint, and this was a role that we had in training the people who did the interviews of people with disabilities about their experiences in guardianship and other options, creating the questions that were used in the with the people with disabilities, and also we did the analysis of the data. And the last project that I'm going to use as an example is a project called Transition Discoveries. That's a project in which we spent 4 years doing qualitative research among youth with disabilities and family members throughout the entire of Pennsylvania to kind of recreate a lexicon of what successful transition looked like based on the wants, needs, goals, desires, and dreams of people with disabilities and their family members, instead of being based on the regulations of the state, local, and federal government. And all of the information for that project is available from that highlighted text. So the next slide, what do we mean by inclusive research? So for us, when we're thinking about research, we're not necessarily thinking about protocol and design, quantitative or qualitative. We're thinking about a broader understanding of how research can be more equally shared and more democratic. We see our role, as a lot of UCEDDs do, in a different role than a typical academy or scholarship, in that in the academy, researchers are typically making decisions about what they want to research and how they want to do it based on their own scholarly needs and trajectory. And we're making those decisions here at our UCEDD based on the needs of the community that we hear, right? So if we're hearing about questions about transition and how understandings of success and realities of success aren't meeting up, that spurs us on to create projects based on the needs of the people who are participating in and experiencing the issues. We want our research to be more inclusive of people with intellectual disabilities across different stages of the research. Oftentimes we see really great projects that start out with wants or needs that they learn from community members or from an environmental scan about people with intellectual disabilities and their families, and that's when the interaction drops off, right? They might go back to them with a final report and have them kind of understand where or how it came, but we really want to make sure that inclusive means inclusive at all stages. This is tough. It makes things take longer. It makes us have to deal with IRB more often. It makes us have to really quantify and qualify why this is important, but I believe it makes the research much more translational, much more important. So for us, the research that we're doing is often called participatory or emancipatory, right? It's giving voice. Well, not giving, right? No one can give voice, but it's supporting people's voice, right? And it's allowing people to participate in asking questions about their own systems, the own things that impact them. Lastly, it's research that matters to people, involves them, and respects them. So I'm going to go over a few participatory action research methods and use the tenets of those methods to talk about the specifics in one of those three examples that I gave. But essentially, participatory action research supports voice both within the project and throughout, and there's a growing attention to the use of this research and methodologies with involvement of constituents at all levels. We've often seen PAR methods be situated with variety of populations that have been historically disenfranchised or not been able to get their ideas heard. And recently, it's moved to the disability field in its entirety. Evidence that PAR empowerment research with persons with disabilities may result in increased skill development, self-reliance, empowerment, and social and policy change. So the first principle of PAR is that it builds on strengths and resources within the community. And so we've seen this in my work through advisory board and community planning committee members that include youth with disabilities, parents and family members, community members, and professionals. We see that building on these strengths allows us to have focus groups with key stakeholders, which would be an alternative to focus groups from people who have less participatory understanding of the issues, right? And we have feedback from stakeholders allow us to create a new phase, a new question. So oftentimes, the beginning part of the PAR principle and starting a research design starts with a focus group and talking to people who are members of those communities, and then taking that feedback from those stakeholders and starting and continuing another phase of the research, kind of erasing and reconceptualizing or rethinking of what we need to do and how we need to do it. For PAR Principle 2, facilitating collaborative partnerships in all phases of the research, that's something that we pay important role to in our work. Oftentimes, there's not typically a grant or an RFP that we go for that doesn't include both a community provider that has experience in the community dealing with some of the reality and community issues that are kind of happening alongside disability, as well as an advocate or self-advocate group that wants to be a part of kind of understanding the phenomena and addressing the issue through a research paradigm. So for us, we often turn to the Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network. They were a big partner for us in our Transition Discoveries project. Essentially, the members of the Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network were members of the research team. They facilitated focus groups. They analyzed data, and they helped us to understand and determine what our outcomes and outputs were. We also work with George Washington University on the transition project, as they have one of the national post-second transition master's transition projects in the state. We've also worked with Patton. For us, that's the special ed arm, the training arm, a special ed arm in the state of Pennsylvania that have allowed us access to that. So we've also worked with the National Council on Disability for the guardianship project that we did, working with law students from George Washington who acted as interviewers and also helped us to understand how they were being taught about laws around guardianship in their classes as up-and-coming lawyers, and the Quality Trust. And most recently for our Project Play, we turned to the work of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative at the University of Pennsylvania, which has allowed us, so we're able to bring our substantive knowledge and expertise working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in the community for 40 years, and their substantive knowledge and expertise working on racial literacy programs and in-school interventions and combating the school-to-prison pipeline, and push that into a collaboration that will deal with kind of the multitude of issues that are addressing inequities. So the next slide, and PAR Principle 3, is integrating knowledge for action and action for mutual benefit of all partners, right? So essentially, knowledge needs to be included in all phases of the research. So we start out with our grants proposal and development of project goals. So it's not just about the idea around the grant, but it's about making sure that there's a monetary participation for people who are coming from community programs, from leadership, from self-advocacy and advocacy organizations, and making sure that they are paid as experts to participate in these projects with us. And then it's about creating the research protocol and development, right? So it's the questions that we're asking in our focus groups. It's making sure we're asking the questions in ways that connect with people who have lived experiences unlike myself, right? I've been trained as an anthropologist. I've asked a million questions of a million people all over the world, but I don't have a lived experience of being a young person in transition, right? So I turn to people in PYLN who have a lived experience of being young people with disabilities in transition and ask them to take my words and reconceptualize them and refacilitate them so that the procedures and the questions of the focus group make sense. And it's not just stuff related to questions and data gathering, but it's all about the experience, right? Where do they want it to be? What do they want the food to be like? What do they want the room to be set up like? How are all of those things going to be specifically associated with their own experiences and understanding, cultural, all of those types of things? So for us, we did focus groups for transition in 8 parts of our state. Pennsylvania is a big, huge state, and there's lots of differentiation among culture, idea, etc. as you go along the state. And so we didn't have 8 different focus group paradigms and procedures that looked exactly the same because it wouldn't have made sense. The way that people want to interact and talk to each other in Southeast Pennsylvania and Philadelphia is very different than the way that people want to interact and talk to each other in the middle of Lancaster County. And so it was making sure that we were connecting with local people who had experience, who knew the communities, and making sure that we were being responsive to the way in which we were developing that protocol. So that also means having to give the IRB multiple protocols for what it's going to look like. It takes longer, but I think it's going to allow for more mutual benefit, more interactive knowledge, right? So ideas about incentives. So as much as we can, as much as our funding partners allow us, we like to be able to incentivize people who participate in our research projects because they're experts and they're giving us their time, and we think that's of value in the same way that us as experts that are creating and doing the data collecting are getting paid for our time. And this was really about going to young people who were from these parts of the state and saying, what do people want? What are, I might want a Target gift card, but that might not fit well for someone who's, from the middle of Johnstown and has never seen a Target, right? Marketing and dissemination. So making sure that the way in which we're recruiting participants, the way in which we're speaking to and about our project reflects our goals and our vision. Data gathering, as I said before, the data gathering was done. So we had focus groups that were youth to youth, so young people facilitating and asking the questions for and with young people, and for the family members and professionals, they were family members and professionals who were facilitating and asking the questions, right? And then with the analysis, so we did a big, large analysis kind of in-house, a qualitative analysis in-house, but we also were able to take pieces of what we did and bring it back to the research members, right? So to the professionals, to the advisory board members, to the people with disabilities, to the young people with disabilities, to the family members. And we were able to kind of break down the qualitative stuff before we were able to theme stuff, before we were able to come to kind of our conclusions, and give it to them to get their point of view on how they were reading it, how they were understanding and analyzing what they were seeing, so that it wasn't just coming from our eyes or from our analytic software, right, but really from someone who had an experiential understanding. And then reports. The reports are created in a benefit for partners. How will this benefit your local community, your local Department of Ed, your local principals, or your local school districts? How will this benefit a local community group that you guys have in developing kind of services and supports around transition? It needed to be able to be readable and legible and make sense. Okay. PAR principle number 4, which is to promote a co-learning and empowering process that attends to social inequalities. So we as researchers learn from the knowledge and theories of the community members involved. Community members acquire further skills in how to conduct research. So not only are people getting experience of conducting research, but they're also becoming CITI certified for human subjects research training, either through a CITI program or a program through the National Science Foundation, finding accessible locations and limitations to those, and then being able to let people know about the accessible, free, low-cost locations that we've found in their locale so that they can use them in creating community programs, etc., and learning about how social inequality gets upheld through research. So really talking about how we're going to not take those steps, how we're going to dismantle those ideas. One of the examples is our simultaneous translation of focus groups to promote linguistic competency of the project and highlight how other projects and institutions may not be addressing the same need. So we held simultaneous translation in Spanish in some of our locations for our focus groups in the Transition Discoveries Project. Also, we have a set of infographics of data that came out of the themes that were analyzed, and there's a set that's in Spanish, a set that's in English, and there's also a set that's text only, so that it can be readable by people who have a hard time looking at text or color. Picture or color, excuse me. PAR principle number 5. So it involves a cyclical and iterative process, right? So projects support growth and development of the community. So in the Transition Project, we were supporting growth and development of PYLN and schools in the communities. In the project on guardianship, supporting the law students, as well as the professor who was teaching the different courses that were dealing with guardianship and other options, right? And so oftentimes that support, though, kind of means that things change along the line. So it may have been that as we first started in our relationship with PYLN, they were ready to participate and had little to say about how the project should be set up. But as we got through year 1 of a 3-year project, they were like, wait a minute, we don't like how we're saying this, or we want a different understanding or a different role in our analysis, or we want to have more to do with the recruitment and the retention of participants. And it meant oftentimes that we kind of had to reflect on what we've been doing and then replan or reapproach, right? Which means that things take longer. But we really call this kind of validation, right? So we call it, so the kind of technical, theoretical way is conducting validation workshops or member checks, right? So going back to the people who are part of the process, going back to the people who are dealing with the phenomena that we're trying to understand, and making sure that they believe that the work that we're doing is valid. Sharing some pre-results, sharing some of what's going wrong and what's going right, and really making sure that they're buying in or believe in what we're doing. So that's where we can utilize advisory committees and community members to analyze, right, and understand, and then to create and or kind of recreate the next round to explore more, to understand things more. So when we thought about kind of having 1 round or 2 rounds of things, as all of these projects have, it really ends up having 3 or 4 rounds because we're in constant relationship with the community that we're working with. And it's really about having the work maintain and be translational, right? Working with and disseminating information into systems in real time, right? So we don't want to spend 10 years working on a project, then to be able to make a report to the government or make a report to the school system that these things have to change in the way that transition is understood or taken on in a school system. We really were having conversations all along with all the stakeholders who were participating in it, sharing with them bits and pieces of what we were learning to be able to kind of have them question some of the ways and some of the supports and services that were happening. And then we start to see things change. As we were participating in this transition project, we saw WIOA change. We saw employment first stuff change, and we were able to have conversations with the people that were implementing parts of those laws to make sure that the curriculums that were included in pre-employment transition services that were getting money from these WIOA grants made sure that the curriculums included right? The voices of people who were transitioning and what they saw as their needs for successful transition, not just what the government was saying had to happen for them to meet certain goals. And principle 6, almost done with principles, is disseminating findings and knowledge gains to all partners. So how often do you guys work in your own silos and you find you have these great outcomes of a project, and you write your report or you write your peer-reviewed journal article, or you do a poster presentation, and then it stops, right? And then we don't really think about how this knowledge can really be translated for partners in all of these different realms of kind of the worlds in which we work, right? We all get to work in these really interdisciplinary places, which is so much fun and gives us kind of a way in which to talk to people from various audiences all the time and make sure our work has kind of value. But sometimes we forget that we then need to be responsible for disseminating findings in ways that work for people, that they can take up what we're finding, that they can take up what's important and use them for their own needs, right? So for us, we were talking about DD Council reports, Developmental Disability Council reports, state meetings, AUCD meetings, AAIDD meetings, transition conferences for our state, right? That's where we get a lot of people from a lot of different realms. Legislative expos, so going and talking to legislators, presenting them with our findings, talking to them about things that are coming down the legislative pipeline and where they should be thinking about it. Different courseworks and different transition programs at different post-secondary ed places, and also youth leadership events. So there's a small picture on the side of the screen that you'll be able to, if you click on the link for Transition Discoveries, you'll be able to see all 55 plus pages of these kind of infographics that we've created, but it was about meeting community, meeting people at their needs. So we met, before we developed these, we met with people who we thought were going to use these infographics, this information, in their work on a daily basis. We went with principals, and we met with people who were in transition coordinating councils. We met with people at IUs. We met with teachers. We met with parents. We met with all different people and asked them, how is this going to best meet your needs? And what came out of it was that people wanted hard copies. People wanted PDF copies, electronic copies. People wanted them in Spanish. People wanted them where it didn't have all of the colorful varieties to that. And we tried to make sure that we were receptive of all of those things. Okay, so now to skip a little bit over to kind of some of the more practical ideas around, so once you're there, once you're doing this work and you end up having to do interviews with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, how do we make sure that the interviews allow for us to get the best information, get the most accurate, the most important information we can, and also privilege and support the ideas and experiences of the people that we're talking to, right? And so we know that there's been kind of lots of history around people with disabilities and other protected populations being taken advantage of in research settings. And we want to make sure that not only are people not being taken advantage of, but people are feeling like they're able to kind of be who they are and give their most informed and most authentic understanding of their responses to the questions. So here are just some kind of interview strategies that we use and that I use to train and teach people in a variety of settings. So I train people who do our NCI interviews for the state, and we also have another kind of interview similar to NCI, which is called Independent Monitoring for Quality, which is essentially the quality assurance arm of our Office of Developmental Programs. These are training strategies that I've used for lawyers and law students. These are training strategies, interviewing strategies that I've used for graduate students from a variety of disciplines that have had little or no experience with people with disabilities. We use these with some of our provider agencies, kind of all along the gamut. But hopefully these, I know a lot of those of you who have had a lot of experience working with people with disabilities. Some of this might feel like second nature to you, but for me, it's important for us to kind of maintain this kind of understanding and continue a conversation about this, because sometimes it gets lost. Most recently, I was invited to train people who do interviews at the for the United States Immigration Bureau. So people who are interviewing people who are looking for visas and looking for green cards who may or may not have disabilities, and how they should be able to use these strategies to make sure that they're giving people the best chance to participate in these really important interviews. So first and foremost, it's really calling the person by their name, and it may not be the name that you were given or that you know, it's really their chosen name, right? What they choose to call themselves, and speaking directly to the individual and not to an interpreter or companion, right? And not making assumptions about whether the individual can participate, right? We always know we're presuming competence, and it's really just about trying to understand what behaviors or what clues or what context we need to see in which how their participation can work. So making sure that we are fulfilling accommodations that are requested, and also framing the survey or interview as a conversation, right? Calling it a survey or interview can be extremely stressful. So there's often times that I've had to change a protocol around interviews or focus groups or surveys because it was too stressful for the person who was participating. So my protocol might have been to have an hour-long interview or an hour-long focus group, and I realized that I have a person there who is really having a hard time speaking to me in a direct way or participating. And I talk to the person and say, or the person, or sometimes the person who works with that person, and talk about what's the best way. And so oftentimes we might break it down. I've spent 6 months recently doing an hour-long interview in one-line emails or one-line texts with a participant. He has a lot to share. He wants to be heard. He wants to talk about how his experience in transition has been beneficial, what he wants his future to look like, but this is the way in which he chooses to communicate with me. So that means kind of modifying my protocol. That means changing the way in which we're setting up the way to do it, but it's about capturing and capturing valuable information from a valuable expert. And if I wouldn't have made that modification or made that change, I would have lost that person's experience. So when specifically interviewing people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, you want to make sure that you're speaking in clear sentences and using concrete concepts, right? Not being abstract. And you want to make sure that you're not using baby talk, right? So gauge the pace of your speech, complexity and vocabulary of your speech according to the individuals. So, and people with IDD may be anxious to please, and an individual may tell you what they want to think or hear. So make sure you're trying to elicit accurate information instead of just want to think or hear. So sometimes it takes a while. It takes a while to warm up, to get information that really comes from their point of view after they've spent so much time telling people what they want to hear or telling people what they need. So, and be patient, right? Change in routine or environment may require a period of adjustment, just like it does for everyone. So oftentimes someone with intellectual or developmental disability may have a speech disability as well, and so you really want to make sure you're able to give your individual and full attention and listen attentively. You don't want to interrupt or finish sentences, and be patient. What you thought of an interview that it may have taken an hour may end up taking 2 hours. You want to give people as much time as they need to speak in the way that works for them so that you can hear what they're saying instead of inferring what they're going to say. You want to ask, if you can't understand, you want to ask for them to repeat. If you're still having trouble, you can ask him or her to write down, or use a person who's familiar with the individual's speech pattern to help you understand what's going on. A really quiet environment makes the communication easier. So here are kind of some of my list of interviewing tips of do's, right, when we're thinking of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And interviewing is kind of the concept. It can be a focus group. It can be a phone call. It can be emailing back and forth, all of those types of things. I think the least beneficial interview when it comes to someone with an intellectual or developmental disability, which I also think is for anyone, is something over the phone. So if I at all am a part of the developing the protocol of a research project, I would nix the phone interview right away. So do allow extra time as needed. Introduce yourself and what your job is. If a person is more comfortable with staff or family, decide if it's appropriate for them to stay or be there with them. Follow up on responses that you do not understand or need clarified. So you don't feel uncomfortable to say, I don't understand, can you repeat that for me? Because there might be some really important information there that your uncomfortableness might disallow you to get or need. So change the format. If the format needs to be changed, if it needs to be 4 15-minute meetings instead of 1 hour, if it needs to be a phone calls or emails or text messages, change the format. And what I do now for all of my IRB stuff is I make sure that I allow for that within my IRB originally, that the format may be changed based on the need of the participant. Make the interview as conversational as possible. Develop a rapport. And be warm and understanding, accepting and neutral, respectful, honest, and appreciative. So accepting and neutral doesn't mean yes, yes, yes to everything they're saying. So understanding and listening, but not taking over and advocating, right? If the attraction of another person's attention and trust, you need to make sure that they understand you, you understand them, right? You want them to feel comfortable. So some more do's. Explain the purpose of the interview. Address terms of confidentiality, right? Getting informed consent or assent. And every university has different kind of rules and regulations around that, as well as every place as well. So right now I'm doing ethnography of the closure of one of our state institutions. And I'm getting really close to having an interview with an individual, and then things around guardianship and family, and even the last kind of the director of the institution may get to make some changes on questions that they're comfortable with me asking, or places that they're willing or allowing for me to be. So this is kind of a different thinking of the structure of the state as kind of giving me different terms of confidentiality and different terms about informed consent that go beyond or different than what my university is saying. And unfortunately, it's the culture of the state and the culture of the people who are running an institution, and I have to be able to be flexible with what they believe in. I can talk to them about my ideas and about ways to change it, but it's their culture that I need to make sure that I am respectful of. So explaining the format of interview, making sure the person knows how to get in touch with you, allowing for questions, and making sure you're asking one question at a time. So the other big thing here is to be careful about the appearance of note-taking. So this is kind of, we need to take notes to make sure that we're capturing people's information well. We oftentimes use audio recorders, but there's pros and cons to both of those things, especially based on people who have had a lot of experience working with systems, working with institutions that take notes around their behaviors, or have audio taped or videotaped their behaviors. So it's really about developing a rapport and helping them understand why we might be doing one of those two things, right? So for my don't in interviewing tips, don't rush. I know it's hard because we've got a lot going on in our days, but it really, especially for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it really hinders their ability to feel comfortable in having a conversation with you. Don't be an advocate, right? This is a hard one because that's probably a hat that a lot of us wear in our jobs in a lot of different ways. But when we choose to be an advocate, it's almost the same for us as choosing to recall the experiences of participants as claims, right? So it's both sides. So we don't want to advocate for them for a change while we're doing the interview, right? It may be after an interview or as we develop a relationship with the person or their family, we can point them in direction of some programs that we might know of. But when it's happening in the interview, we really want to make sure that we're eliciting a true and authentic response from them. And the same side, we want to make sure that we're responding or recording their responses as their truth, as their experiences. I have a graduate student who continuously responds or records things as claims or assertions, and I have to keep explaining to him that these are not their claims, these are their truths, and that's not the way that we can highlight the information that we're getting, right? Whether or not you feel like you believe it or you feel like it's authentic to you, it is the person's truth. So don't interview the individual through an interpreter, right, and not look at or speak to the individual. If there's questions that you have, you can speak to the interpreter before or after, or say, hey, I have a question for your interpreter, and talk to them. But make sure that everything is directed to the person or the individual first. And don't show strong emotional reactions to their responses. Sometimes we're going to hear things that are painful or hard, but we want to make sure that our responses are calm and thoughtful and and so really we want to practice kind of the art or the understanding of active and reflective listening. So hearing and responding back, and kind of the art of listening, clarifying, and then listening again. So it's important to remember that this is not about you, that this is about the person with whom you're speaking or visiting, and you really want to make sure that if there's issues, that you want to be impartial and be attentive and listen to understand, but not listen to respond, not listen to argue or criticize or even interpret or evaluate, right? Let the person finish what they're saying, and even if you don't agree with them. And at this point, some of the clarifying questions that you can ask are really about, can you tell me more about that? Can you tell me how you feel about that? Can you help me understand what you mean, right? Or give me an example, right? As opposed to listening so that you can argue or understand or identify with, right? So body language, facial expressions, those are all things that are really important to kind of maintain in this setting, right? Fidgeting or getting tired or bored might reflect that way to the participant. They could think, I don't know what to do, I'm not doing something, what I'm saying isn't important, right? Smiling or gleaming, right, may make the person think, I want to tell me those things specifically, right? So we want to try to kind of be as impartial, which I know we can't be as we can. So just to going along with this is that oftentimes the person who we're going to interview or talk to or who are going to participate in our focus groups don't speak traditionally, right? And so we want to make sure that you're going into the setting understanding who you're going to interact with and understanding about the different communication recommendations, right? You're being prepared for the visit by gathering information before the interview about the person's communication style. For example, asking how the person respond when he or she is happy, sad, angry, likes something, doesn't like something, right? And obtaining information from family and staff about the person's communication history. Sometimes that includes assessments or speech therapy or device usage or use of a communication profile or goals. And if a communication device is used, it should be identified beforehand and set up the appointment at a time where the device is with the individual and in working condition. So really this is about making sure to acknowledge and understand that everybody communicates and has an opinion about his or her life, and we just need to figure out how they communicate. And it's possible to learn from people who communicate in alternative ways. And it's really about kind of maintaining and assuming intelligence and high expectations and gathering information and preparing for communication. So we have some vocabulary aids that we use here at the Institute. It's just a board, a piece of cardstock that we've created that sometimes can help if we're entering into a situation where we don't know a lot about the person's communication style to begin with. But oftentimes that might be our first meeting with them, and then from there we'll be able to move on. And I gave some links where you can download them, and we're actually changing them for now, but there's a Spanish and English and a Haitian Creole one. But sometimes it's just these kind of really low-tech devices that allow for these communication kind of barriers to be lifted and to start to change. And from there, rapport can be built and things can go on. Okay, so, sorry, I'm talking a lot. Okay, we're almost done. So back to kind of big picture. So we started out talking about big picture with the principles of PAR and trying to connect those to some of the actual work that we've done here at the Institute on Disabilities. And then I talked a little bit about some of the do's and don'ts for interviewing and the strategies that we use. And then I'm coming back to big picture. So for me, these are the guiding principles that I think of as we're developing a research protocol, as we're kind of even developing questions in our head about there's this phenomena, we're hearing a lot about it from the community, or we're seeing it happening in the community, and we want to make sure that what we're seeing and what's going on and the experiences that people are having really fit well with the way that we're deciding to investigate them. And so these are 4 guidelines that I use in, the way as I'm teaching around methods, and I use to really kind of understand and interpret any project or anything that we start out on, or anytime someone asks us to participate in something with them. So my first guidelines, and I don't have answers to these, but these are really the questions that keep me moving, keep my head moving as I'm maintaining or trying to maintain a really high level of equity in inclusivity. So the first guideline is who or what are we trying to understand? And the question that I ask myself is, are our inclusive research efforts focused on fixing marginalized people or on fixing the inequitable conditions and structures that marginalize people? So this is really a question I keep asking myself as I'm looking at unit of analysis, as I'm looking at qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods, as I'm looking at who's asking the questions, who are we asking, who are we including in understanding, who are we excluding, all of those types of things. Guideline 2 for me is, does our work mitigate or transform? And the question here for me is, are our inclusive research efforts a threat to the existence of injustice, or do they merely mitigate the systems of injustice? Right? Are we participating in the system of injustice by investigating this issue in the way that we're investigating it, or are we threatening the system? Guideline 3 is, are we dancing around or digging in? Are our inclusive research efforts contributing to the permanent redistribution of access and opportunity, or leaving the current distribution in place and helping marginalized people be more comfortable as marginalized people? So, are we talking about inclusion, or are we talking about justice? Inclusion for me is helping marginalized people be more comfortable as marginalized people in an included space in a bigger paradigm or a bigger institution or a bigger system. Justice is about disrupting the place, disrupting the system. And my 4th guideline is, who are the experts? Are our inclusive research efforts based in collaborations with marginalized people, deferring to their expertise, or are we working on marginalized people or with marginalized people? So I wonder if we have some time for questions now, if people have any feedback or questions or comments. I can't see anything on my screen, Leslie, so if there's any questions that pop up, if you could read them to me, or...
Sure. No questions have come through right now or while you were speaking. I'm unmuting people, and so I'm almost finished, and then we'll open it up.
Your mom's got 100 of those, like, these little.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions?
And, like, after a while, they just, like, I don't know if it's, or whatever. It doesn't seem like they really, like, want to work for very long. Yeah. You might as well just get.
This is Lori Higginbotham.
Hi, Lori.
Hi. Can you tell a little bit about how you recruited people for the interviewing process?
I don't know. I can't even. Yeah.
So people to be interviewed or people who are interviewers?
No, people to interview.
So it depends on the project. So for our transition project, we did a lot of so specific kind of recruiting in the specific locations in which we were moving to. So we started with some of the people who have worked on different leadership training projects in the past in Pennsylvania and reached out to them. And then we reached out to local transition coordinating councils or local IUs, local school districts. But we also reached out to kind of non-education-based community partners as well. So immigration services and supports, places that were supporting people who were immigrants, places that were supporting people with health or education needs. And we used kind of videos, so some YouTube videos. We had people from Pennsylvania Youth Leadership Network go to different community events and talk about it. We sent out flyers. So kind of lots of different levels. And in some places it worked really well. So we tend to find that there's parts of our state where people are really responsive to different community chat rooms or through Facebook. And then in other parts of our state, we have to go to meetings, or we have to go to association groups, or we have to go to those types of things. So it kind of was a broad gamut. And for the Transition Discoveries project, we had a total of, I think it was over 650 people who participated in focus groups and interviews. Which gave us countless hours of audio tape, of audio analysis.
Not bad. So, Sally, I had a question. This is Leslie. You outlined a lot of different steps that were pertinent to you for research, but it seemed to me that these are the same and would parallel in really a lot of other things that we might be doing as UCEDDs, which would be training, could be direct services. Do you find that that we could apply this across the board, and are the same kind of ethical questions only for research or also in how we interact?
I think that you could apply, absolutely, those four big questions that are, and you have to forgive me because I'm an anthropologist, so I tend to think really big in those ways. But those four big questions, I think, could be applied to curriculum design or to project development or to leadership training, all of those things. So are we making sure that all of those needs are being met, right? And you might change the noun in those. So I use marginalized people because I'm trying to kind of make it broad and make it big, but for you, if we're thinking about a parent training program, it might be really the noun in those things become, are we working on parents of people with disabilities, or are we working with parents of people with disabilities in those questions? So I think these can be used in the work that we do in a lot of ways. Absolutely, and I would argue as a researcher and evaluator that there's something in all of the work that we do that can give us benefit for evaluation or understanding or research. So even if it is a training or a curriculum or whatever, a workshop, whatever it may be, I think knowing and making sure that we're gathering information and outcomes and outputs alongside can benefit all of the work that we're doing.
Great.
And quite frankly, I think these four guidelines are what makes a UCEDD or a LEND so valuable in kind of the world of scholarship and the world of the academy, because I don't think necessarily traditional scholars are asking those same questions with the same level of importance in their work.
Right. I agree. Any other questions? I have one more. I just didn't want to monopolize. In terms of the last statement that you just gave, do you find that, or does your center work with other individuals, either through providing trainings about increasing their awareness about these issues, if they're doing research or training or anything like that with individuals with disabilities, how to do that appropriately?
Yes, we do. We've worked through kind of some of the service provider agencies around some of this stuff. We work with the people who do the independent monitoring for NCI and for what we call I'm4Q. So we develop the instrument and the survey, but it's done independently throughout the state, and we train the monitoring teams or the interviewing teams who participate in those. We've worked on kind of national scale stuff when it comes to oftentimes kind of one of the new things we see a lot is people having partnerships between a disability organization and a non-disability organization that's dealing with looking at an issue at the same time. So we want to go in and train and support the people who say are dealing with health inequity to make sure that they're being that they're approaching the work in interviewing and people with disabilities appropriately and with enough knowledge and understanding, even though they may be talking about health, right? Or even though people might be talking about food security, we want to make sure that they have the knowledge and background and expertise about intellectual and developmental disabilities to make sure that they're getting the real authentic response from those people, even though they're talking about food insecurity or issues of immigration or whatever it may be. So it's about developing those relationships, right, and us learning from them and them learning from us.
Absolutely.
Because oftentimes although we want to take on that work, we might not be the best people situated in that community to understand that. So we hear from our community that food insecurity is a big issue, right? But we don't have the touch, we don't have the reach in our community to understand where all of that is happening. So in partnering with people who are dealing with food insecurity and then them teaching us about their understanding and us teaching them about how disability is affected by it, we can then kind of create some sort of research that is responsive to both communities at the same time. Instead of working on these things on our own that are only responsive to our own communities.
That's great. Thank you. So with 1 minute left, it was very helpful. Any other last-minute questions or comments? Okay, with that, no, it was very helpful, and thank you so much for sticking in there with us and joining us again this month, Sally.
Yeah. Okay, take care, everyone. My email's on the screen. If any questions, feel free.
Great, will do. Thank you. Bye-bye.